Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Stefan Tornquist. I'm the managing director of executive summary research and the writer of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. So for the next couple of months, I'm stealing the host chair from Matt Phelan to speak with the academics and experts who are contributing to this project. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. It's mid-January. It's cold, but not terribly so. Uh, and I'm really excited for our guest today. James Hewitt is kind of a one of one. He's clearly obsessed with performance, going back to his days as a racing cyclist, or today working with Formula One, which I'm told is very popular in some parts of the world. And actually, no, it's gotten very popular here as well. James advises some of the world's largest organizations, and he's recently the author of Regenerative Performance, which we'll certainly touch on. James, thanks for being here. Why don't you expand on where I started and tell us a bit about your work?
Oh, thank you, Stefan. Really happy to do that. So as you mentioned, I describe myself as a human performance scientist. And really my main interest is how can we equip people with the tools that they need to transform pressure into peak performance? We're all facing all kinds of pressure, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's an elite athlete, whether it's a Formula One driver or their team. And so I'm fascinated by how people can not just survive those high pressure environments, but actually if they've got the right team, the right resources, the right skills, how they can actually grow stronger through those challenging experiences. And that's a world that I've been in now for over 20 years. That journey started when I was a full-time racing cyclist, which I did until I realized I wasn't good enough. Went back to university, eventually set up a coaching business, which is what you do when you're a failed athlete, but found my niche working with very high-performing business people. Because as much as I wanted to work with pro athletes, and I got to work with a few professional cyclists, the people who really paid the bills in the early 2000s were the management consultants, technology workers, and investment bankers who decided they wanted to be Lance Armstrong and before his downfall. And so they were working 80 hours a week, racing 180 kilometers at the weekend. And I developed a coaching practice serving them. But I realized very quickly that in order to be able to plan their physical training effectively, I needed to account for the load associated with their working life. And that was the spark of this curiosity about how we can understand this relationship between effort and recovery in the workplace and in knowledge work, in specifically where we think for a living. And I realized that we could approach knowledge work almost like a cognitive endurance activity, in a similar way that you might think about cycling as a physical endurance activity. And that insight, translating learnings from sport to business and keeping a foot in both camps, led me to get headhunted by a human performance company in Switzerland, and which was extensively involved in Formula One. And the founder of that company was kind enough to give me a job and also mentor me. And that company ended up being behind 19 world championships in Formula One. I got to work with incredible drivers and teams. I continue to work in Formula One today, thanks to relationships that I initially built there, and maintained this dual approach where I continue to work in elite sporting environments with top businesses, but all exploring this question: how do we equip people to perform at their best when the pressure is highest, so they don't break, they break through, and developing science-based tools to do that. And so along that journey, I also picked up a PhD in human performance science, focused on the workplace and focused on pressure in the form of always-on work, that continuous connectivity that pulls us in multiple directions, and thinking about trying to understand how we can equip people to perform at their best, to sustain high performance, and really figure out the enablers of that sustained high performance through that academic process before applying it to my work, which today looks like a combination of speaking and consulting, which I've had the privilege to do in about 35 countries now.
So that's a perfect jumping off point. You talked about the always on nature of work. And so what we asked you to do, because, given the breadth of your work, we could have kind of pointed you at anything. And what we asked you to do was to think about artificial intelligence. Obviously, it has potential implications sort of on both sides of the ledger. And so you came back with a wonderful piece, and you begin talking about digital debt, which is, of course, our always on work and life, mixed culture, right? Or mixed work style. And you talked about, I think the average was sort of 250, 275 messages or different alerts arriving. So I did a quick inventory after reading your essay. And there are 8 different platforms in which I get work-related comms, averaging between 300 and 400 a day. And, now granted, some of those interactions actually are work, but the vast majority don't really, they don't build value. They just push some ball or pull it often enough. And the thing is, that's not unusual. In fact, I probably don't, there are many people on this call and many people who report to people on this call who are, whose numbers are even more egregious, maybe not as many platforms. So it's not unusual. Before we get into AI and its relationship here, how does that affect us?
What you've just described is the perfect illustration of why so many knowledge workers feel like they're running on a hamster wheel. And as you alluded to, the data, both what we see at a group level, but also individually, tell a really stark story. So emails and notifications arriving faster than they can be processed. Some research indicates that 84% of us keep our inboxes open at all times in the background. 70% of us read emails within 6 seconds of receiving them. And that compulsion is so strong, 42% of people admit to using email in the bathroom. Now, of course, no one listening to this podcast would ever do a thing like that, I'm sure. But
you mean admit to it? Probably not.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But the real cost is that every time one of those 300 or 400 pings hits you, you're potentially incurring what I describe as a focus tax. And research indicates that we accumulate this attention residue because every time we switch between tasks, some of our attention remains stuck to the previous task, which makes the next task more effortful. And it also takes us longer to get back up to speed. And when you add that up across all those notifications, the cost of fragmented attention communication overload is estimated to be about 180 hours lost annually per employee. So that's about 4.5 working weeks just gone, vanished into thin air. But there's a paradox because despite the fact that we're working longer, we're always on, well, 64% of people say they still don't feel like they've got enough time to get everything done. So we're working more, but we're accomplishing less of what actually matters. And that's one of the reasons why that digital debt just keeps on compounding.
Yeah. And you use a great metaphor around gears. You describe knowledge workers being stuck in a middle gear. So just talk about that and why is it so much more exhausting to be stuck in that middle gear than perhaps doing deep work?
Yeah, so I mentioned I've got this background in endurance sport. And if you're working with an endurance athlete, or maybe you are an endurance athlete, or even just a fitness enthusiast, you're probably familiar with this idea of using a heart rate monitor to measure the intensity of your physical work. And maybe even this idea of heart rate zones, which could range from a low intensity gentle walk up to a high intensity all out effort. Well, cognitive gears is a heuristic. It's a mental model designed to help us think about the type and intensity of our knowledge work, of our cognitive work. So you can imagine this spectrum where at one end, we've got what I describe as high cognitive gear. So that's focused, sustained attention on our highest priority tasks. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got this low cognitive gear, characterized by rest, recovery, reflection, maybe pausing, letting your mind wander. And then you've got this middle cognitive gear, characterized by overloaded calendars, overflowing email inboxes, and this overwhelming digital debt. So if you think about where you spend most of your time, unfortunately, most knowledge workers spend their days in this middle gear. You might call it a no man's land for productivity. And it's characterized by these tasks that require some attention, but where we're constantly switching, attending to meetings, reading reply to emails, sending instant messages, completing small, less complex items on our to-do list. Now, the reality is some time in middle gear is inevitable, and it might even be helpful. We've all got little tasks to do. It gets to the end of the day, for me anyway, I'm feeling a little bit tired, a bit distracted, and these small tasks where I switch between different tasks is actually perfect. But the problem is that this middle gear time ends up creeping into all of our day. It seeps into throughout our working hours. and even into the bathroom, as we heard, where some people seem to use their phones. And that's having this dramatic effect on eroding attention, fragmenting our focus, and leading to increased stress as well as lost productivity.
Yeah, I was thinking about how you said the no man's land of productivity, and I was thinking about one of my versions of low gear are long walks in the morning with the dog. Um, and then I sort of if I don't have meetings, my most productive periods of the day is early in the day after that walk, and that would be sort of the highest gear. Both of them can produce creative ideas, like walking a dog, taking a shower, going for a run. That's when sort of unbidden, something that you might have been working on, sort of pops in your head, and some of your best ideas can come from there. And obviously they can come from deeper work. And I mean, it's interesting thinking about AI and how it does a lot of the sort of the fat part of the pyramid work. And, at its best sort of leaves you to the highest value. And I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too far. But at the same time, there's the opportunity for it to explode the middle gear, or to give us more of top and bottom. Anyway, that creative time, that high value time, is antithetical to what we've just described is our real work lives, which are just blown to smithereens. All right, so we've talked about the gears, and I could think that leads us into the difference between productivity and productivity theater. The appearance of busyness is unfortunately a big part of corporate life. So how do you spot the differences? Not in a punitive way, but in the attempt to help people avoid the theater.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's got a deep root, because I think one of the challenges is, before we get onto kind of how do we spot the difference, is that so many knowledge workers feel compelled to signal their presence. Perhaps even more so than they feel the need to be productive sometimes, because we've always used in knowledge work hours spent in the office traditionally, or now online, as a proxy for productivity. And there's this really interesting trust gap as well. There's data to indicate that, particularly when we move to more hybrid or remote work models, there's a huge gap between the percentage of employees who feel that they're productive and the percentage of leaders who trust that their teams are being productive. And because of this trust gap, many employees feel this need to signal that they're present, particularly maybe even at specific times, to create this illusion of continual engagement, even when they're not working constructively, perhaps. Now, I think there's some genuine bad actors who are taking advantage of the system. And so, they're the kind of the worst example of productivity theatre is probably highlighted by the people who are using what's called mouse jigglers. Yeah. So these devices which mimic mouse movement so that you can hit the signals that would indicate you're online and working. And scarily, when the pandemic shifted everyone or most people to remote working, you can see in the Google search results a huge uptick in searches for mouse jigglers. I should have come out with one at that point. I could have retired.
Branded mouse jiggler.
But yeah, exactly. But regardless of the driver behind that, whether it's people genuinely trying to cheat the system, or I think more likely people just feel this pressure because they don't feel trusted by their leaders, on average, employees spend over an hour online each day, sending low priority emails, liking chat messages, just to reassure colleagues and probably leaders that they're still on the clock. So spotting the difference requires asking some potentially uncomfortable questions about the type of work that we do. A classic one is meetings. I think meetings are probably one of the most egregious examples of productivity theatre outside of mouse jigglers, if I'm honest. Because how many meetings have we all been part of that could have been replaced with a single well-worded email? We convince ourselves that we're productive because we're in a meeting, but a lot of the time we're just busy. And so ask that question, is that meeting really necessary? Or is it happening because someone wanted to look like they had something meaningful in their calendar? Also, when we're responding and replying to email, not in the bathroom, are those emails at 11 p.m. evidence of dedication or an attempt to signal availability? And I challenge leaders with this as well, because I know quite a few leaders who are very comfortable working out of hours. And there's an interesting distinction where some people are characterized by what's called a high work-life segmentation preference. They really want to keep work and life separate. Other people are work-life integrators. They're very comfortable with that blend. The problem is that a leader with a high preference for integration, who's very comfortable switching between work and home life, put the kids to bed, work a bit in the evening, they send an implicit signal that that's expected of everyone else. And so, we see this. There was some data from Microsoft that indicates that every hour that a leader works after hours adds another 20 minutes of extra work for all of their direct reports, creating this cascading effect, this activity avalanche. So regardless of the motivation, again, I'd say just be mindful of the signal you're sending. Is that 11 p.m. email you trying to show you're available? Is it just merely a preference that might be fine for you, but sends an unhelpful signal to the team, which maybe means you should think about using a delay send feature, for example. So you're free to write and hit send on the email if you're productive then, but don't send that implicit signal to others. There's some really interesting evidence around email meetings as well. Just to go back onto that topic, that it seems that about 5% of the workforce are responsible for generating 60% of all meetings. And this is the person who it seems that they think that no problem is too small, that it doesn't require 7 people to solve it. That a 60-minute meeting duration for them seems like it's a personal target to be exceeded. And their greatest pleasure in life seems to be to set another recurring meeting in your calendar. And the interesting thing is you can identify what I call meeting makers now, using workplace analytics data, and maybe even target those people with some really practical tools to help them to improve their thinking around whether a meeting is truly required. And I'd say those two would be my top tips.
Order effect. Is there someone else on their team who's so terrible in email threads, who's so exact in their communications that meetings are the only... Anyway, sorry.
It could be, but I think that the key here is that the distinguish between work that's truly effective versus work that's just filling the time or maybe sending unhelpful signals. And I think it's key that leaders model something different to help their employees avoid this theatre, whether that's delaying send, whether that's being more intentional about meetings, so being clear about the purpose of the meeting, being clear about the people who are invited, which means that everyone has a clearly assigned role. Fear of missing out is not a valid reason. And also committing to be fully present. For me, one of the biggest signals of whether a meeting is productivity theatre or productive is, are the people in that meeting fully present? Because if, like unfortunately many people do, everyone is multitasking on their phones, on their laptops, doing emails at the same time, well, did that meeting even need to happen? Or if it did, it probably could have been 15 minutes rather than 45. So practically, this often involves establishing protocols that require people to assess if a meeting's genuinely necessary before scheduling it. It means redefining success metrics away from hours worked or messages sent towards actual outcomes achieved. And critically, it means celebrating people who protect their focus time and achieve results efficiently, rather than those who simply appear busy.
I have 2 questions. One is very small. Does it work when leaders make the effort for their emails or their comms to say, listen, I like to work at all hours. This is, I don't want you to, the language is, obviously personal to the leader. Does it work to tell people, hey, look, I love to work when I'm, on the rowing machine in the middle of the night. That doesn't mean I want you to reply, wait till working hours. Does that work?
Yeah, so I think systems, proactive systems do seem to work. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do when it comes to email is rethink our implicit promises to respond rapidly to every email. Because often there's this implicit assumption that email will be treated like instant messaging. Second, across the team, do an experiment where you batch email into more intentional blocks during the day rather than checking email continually. And third, communicate those intentional checking blocks using something like an email signature. And that may include a disclaimer, such as the one you just described, where someone says, my checking blocks are 9 midday and 9 in the evening. I don't expect you to reply at this time. This fits with my rhythm. And I've seen that these type of systems where people rethink those implicit promises across a team, challenge those assumptions that we use email like instant messaging, that they commit to batching email. For some people, it's 5 times a day. For some people, it's 3. Some extremists manage to do it once. I don't know how they manage to do that. But
Sounds
then
fantastic.
The people who communicate that proactively seem to save about an hour per day in terms of reduced time spent processing email.
Completely. One more quick question on this, and we really should get to AI, to be fair. You talked about the work-life integrators. I'm just curious whether there's a very strong correlation between having a large degree of autonomy and being a work-life integrator. I've worked from home since the early 2000s, and been a relatively independent actor. And I think my interaction patterns would probably describe a work-life integrator. But I think it has a strong relationship with the fact that if I need to go to the dentist or go for a run or whatever, those things are within my control. I just wonder whether I don't know, maybe seniority is a proxy here, but I wonder whether the concept of autonomy has a strong relationship.
100%. And actually that concept of autonomy, of having a sense of being able to be self-directed and have a level of control over how you deploy your time, your energy, and what you do, actually is a thread that runs through for both integrators and segmenters. So the most unhelpful thing that can sometimes can lead to increased risk of burnout is where people don't have the autonomy to work and live in a way that's consistent with what you might call their boundary management strategies. And that's just a sophisticated way of saying how we choose to set up our life and work. So, for example, you'll find that if an integrator doesn't have the autonomy to blend and someone says you cannot check your email outside of working hours, that significantly increases stress. And that's an interesting thing because sometimes very well-meaning well-being practitioners will try and impose those rigid rules. But what they don't realize is you've got segmenters who say, great, this has given me a sense of autonomy because now I don't have to check my email outside of hours. But for an integrator, you're actually taking away autonomy, and that can increase stress. So I think it's critical that notion of autonomy is really front and center when we're exploring interventions that are going to shift people's ways of working and living, because we might unintentionally violate someone's deeply held preference. And granted, we've all got to compromise. Let's not be utopian about this. You're never going to have perfect integration versus segmentation aligned with exactly what you want and when. But I think it's helpful for workplaces and leaders to think about how we might accommodate some of those preferences more often than we don't.
Well, your use of the word utopian is perfect because, of course, artificial intelligence is inevitably going to usher in a utopian state where all of the drudgery is taken off our plates, leaving us to just low and high and nothing in between. Right? That's how it's going to go down, I'm assuming. Although maybe not quite yet, because right now all it's doing is generating, not all it's doing, but one of the things that it's doing is generating an enormous amount of content and other kinds of noise, which seems to raise a risk of deploying AI tools before we've sort of come to grips with how it's going to affect our work habits or vice versa.
Absolutely. And, I've just got back from CES, actually, the Consumer Electronics Show. And, it's obviously AI, everything now, plus AI and robotics. And, we're all going to have a personal robotic chef next year by the looks of it. And we'll be free
to see the Boston Dynamics robots doing their backflips.
Really impressive. Yeah. And with Hyundai and actually participating in unloading of packages and building cars and all kinds of cool stuff. And so I am bullish and I am positive about the potential of these artificially intelligent technologies. I'm not a utopian, but I generally am quite pro technology. I think there's great potential in these tools, but also profound risks. I think it's important to be optimistic without being utopian, but also recognize the real downsides without being dystopian. And I'm not convinced that Skynet's going to launch and we're going to be reliving the Terminator movies for real. But still, there's
a risk. I'm
much
more afraid of us at the moment than I am of the artificial intelligences.
Yeah. And that's a whole other conversation, isn't it?
Yeah,
but I think
Skynet might save us for all I know.
You never know, as well as making our burgers. And I think that for me, one of the most profound risks is that organizations are sleepwalking into their adoption of some of these AI tools. If we think, for example, that we're already drowning in 300 to 400 pings per day and losing 180 hours annually to communication overload, what happens, and arguably it's already happened, when AI makes it trivially easy to generate even more content? And so, I'll give you a practical example of this. There's tools now which will automatically draft your email replies for you. And now, at the moment, that's often asymmetric. So you've got someone who's not an early AI adopter doing old school email processing, maybe with an assistive AI tool that's checking their spelling and improving grammar. But then you might have an early AI adopter who's using an AI tool to automatically queue up all their replies to emails in advance, and they just have to click send. Now, what happens when both sides of that equation are using these AI tools? Now, even if we set aside the fact that because people are not reading and replying themselves, there's going to be huge loss of institutional as well as individual learning, because within organizations, we don't really know what's going on. We're just outsourcing it to AI agents and AI tools. If we are aware of it and we're reading it, there could just be this proliferation of content.
Mutually assured distraction.
Well, yeah, that's a good way to put it. And one of the challenges that I see as well is they're constantly adjusting these prompts. But there was an analysis of an underlying prompt for one of the very popular large language models a while ago, which revealed that some of its configurations, I think it was a deep research configuration in this case, was actually optimized in its underlying instructions for verbosity. So it was actually instructed to provide more lengthy responses. And I've noticed this myself. I imagine some of the people listening to this have as well. So there's people that I work with who will remain unnamed, who, when ChatGPT started to become more prevalently used, and then Gemini and Anthropic and some of these other tools, let's not pick on any one, suddenly emails that would have been, great, I'll see you tomorrow, with the deepest thanks for your message. It would be my most esteemed privilege to make my way to our meeting in the hallowed meeting room. I mean, that's a little bit over the top, but not far off. Suddenly this 2-liner email became this 3-paragraph essay. And I think there's this maybe a specific danger there that essentially AI amplifies whatever patterns already exist. And so if your organization is already stuck in middle cognitive gear, endless emails, constant meetings, perpetual task switching, I would argue there's a risk that AI is only going to supercharge that dysfunction. You're going to get more emails drafted in seconds rather than minutes, more meetings that generate more meeting summaries, that generate more follow-up meetings, more documents that require more responses, that create more threads. And the underlying pathology isn't insufficient communication capacity. I think we've lost sight of what actually creates value. Knowledge work is a cognitive endurance activity, I'd argue. And like an endurance activity, flooding the system with more volume doesn't improve performance, it degrades it.
All right. So you talk about this exactly in your essay, and the need to start with our own operating systems before engaging. The technology isn't going to solve the problem, essentially. What is that new operating system? What does the upgrade look like?
So the operating system is based on that fundamental idea of cognitive gears, but really that is representing a fundamental shift in how we measure and value work. So the old operating system equated hours worked with productivity, and presence with commitment. And that system was flawed long before AI came along. And it's actively dangerous now in terms of it potentially leading to burnout and maybe even like serious health conditions, just because we work so long, so hard, we're so distracted with so much stress. This new operating system recognizes that knowledge work is cognitive endurance. Like athletic performance, it requires the right mix of intensity and recovery, not endless, moderate effort. And so practically, I'd argue it looks something like this. First, conduct a calendar purge. So audit your meetings and ask ruthlessly, does this need to exist? Could it be an email? Could the meeting that remains be half as long? There's some estimations that annual savings from cutting unnecessary meetings could be worth about $2.5 million a year for organizations that have only got 100 employees. So never mind the benefits for people's well-being. Second, protect focus time. So your team needs periods where they can work in high cognitive gear, sustained attention, focused without interruption on their highest priority task. So consider one meeting-free day per week, for example, where employees can work according to those natural rhythms. The early birds, maybe they do that high gear work when they first wake up. The night owls, maybe they do it in the evening. And even that small change, one day a week, can make a surprisingly significant difference. Some data indicate that providing knowledge workers with dedicated periods of focus, modelled on 5 sectors of the US economy, could boost those sectors equivalent to $468 billion a year. And so if the first is conducting a calendar purge, rationalizing email, cutting down on middle gear, the second is about high gear, protecting focus time. The third aspect of this new mental operating system is about low cognitive gear and recovery. And so if you're sending emails at midnight, you're implicitly demanding your team to do the same if you're a leader. Maybe you're signaling presence unnecessarily if you're not. So let's be explicit about when we're working asynchronously versus expecting a real-time response. Start using schedule send features to do after-hours work during after-hours work, so our after-hours work doesn't become their after-hours work. And maybe do that proactive email protocol implementation where you start to think about challenging the assumptions of responding to all emails rapidly, being clear about when you do email, batching it, and then communicating that clearly across your team. And then fourth, I would say, let's again try and redefine some of the metrics associated with performance. Stop celebrating busy, start recognizing people who achieve outcomes efficiently, who protect their recovery, who avoid generating unnecessary activity for others. And only once these habits start to be established, then I think we can ask, how can AI help us do this better, consistent with that new mental operating system? And that's where I see AI becoming an accelerant, a catalyst for excellence, rather than an amplifier of dysfunction.
Yeah, so because you absolutely can imagine artificial intelligence with its ability to take a more nuanced look at something as simple as a calendar, conforming to, well, James is a night owl, so we're going to protect him in these ways versus, Marcy, who's a early bird or what have you. So, I mean, it's very simple stuff, but it's more than our current guardrails can do. What's a diagnostic question for assessing whether an AI tool is going to be a plus or a minus in this context?
So, I mean, I think that what you described is where AI could be genuinely transformative if it's deployed with the right intent. But let's just make it concrete and just answer that question. Does this help me spend more time on the things that matter? And one way to think about it is, does this help me spend more time in high gear or low gear and reduce time in that middle gear? And so to give you a concrete comparison of that, imagine an AI tool that would pass that test. So it could be an AI meeting summarizer that generates comprehensive notes and action items, of which there are plenty, but it's deployed alongside a policy of reducing meeting frequency. And so, it's this kind of hybrid approach where it's the AI and the human. It's the AI that might be doing the summarization, but it's the human that's ultimately going to be responsible for setting the culture. So the AI handles the cognitive load of documentation. It frees attendees to be fully present rather than scribbling notes. Summaries are asynchronous, meaning people can review them, in their natural middle gear time, perhaps, rather than requiring another meeting to discuss the meeting. And that tool would enable fewer higher quality meetings, more uninterrupted focus time, and it shifts time from that middle gear towards both high gear, better presence, fewer meetings, and low gear, less post-meeting admin. So that's one example. I can think of some others. Imagine an AI tool that fails that test. If you wanted to do a bit of a diagnostic in the other direction, imagine as we talked about, this AI email assistant that drafts replies instantly and encourages inbox zero by responding to everything as it arrives. On the surface, it looks like productivity, and there are some tools on the market that are offering that functionality now, but I'd argue that it just accelerates the expectation of an instant response, trains your contacts to expect immediate replies, potentially keeps us perpetually in reactive middle gear. So the tool doesn't end up freeing up focus time, it fills that time with more communication cycles, forward and back, forward and back. So your inbox might be empty, or at least close to empty a lot of the time, but we would end up depleting our cognitive reserves because we've trained everyone around us to expect even faster responses going forward. So I would argue that
you create the cycle that you described earlier. This
exactly
an automated communication cycle to what end?
Ping pong. And so the diagnostic question isn't about the technology's capability so much; it's about the behavioural effect. The summary would be: does this tool help me consolidate time in focus high gear work and genuine low gear recovery, or does it fragment my attention further while creating the illusion of productivity? Referring back to my earlier point that if we don't deal with the underlying system, AI is just going to accelerate dysfunction.
So, last formal question. If I could do anything, it would be to do exactly what you've described, which is, minimize that time in the middle gear. But what about as AI models are getting faster, smarter, stronger, I'm allowing them into more of my high cognitive gear time. And it's very appealing to take shortcuts, because if you're a senior, you've done a lot of whatever it is, you feel like, well, I'm in a good position to editorialize, to decide, to discriminate, and I know what's good and what's bad. But I do wonder, as I'm letting it do the first outline or some activity like that. This is without any research. What do you think? Like, at what point are we, like, sure, we're doing task A, even a fairly high cognitive task, more quickly, perhaps more, even it could be better. The output could be better because you've got just a little bit more time to work on it. But are there non-regenerative effects on the user of offloading some of your real thinking to an AI?
So I think inevitably that will be the case, because we know that the human system is very efficient, and generally what doesn't get used becomes weaker. We just allocate resources away from it. And so
has memory itself gotten worse since Google?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you think about just very simple examples, my eldest son is preparing for his GCSEs, and I was looking at one of his maths papers, and there's stuff in there that I can't remember how to do, because I've just not done certain aspects of maths, or math, as my American friends would say. So that's inevitable. I think the question is, how much does it matter? And with some aspects, I think it really matters. Particularly if we are continually outsourcing critical thinking, where we're not actually doing that critical thinking ourselves, where, again, with automatic email drafting, we're not investing in our collaborative skills and the skills that we need to be able to respond with empathy and emotional intelligence, for example, which is a skill which needs to be continually trained. And I think that we're going to have to reckon with the question at some point of just because we can automate something, should we? Now, I'm not a complete dystopian pessimist in this, because we've seen for years that as people advance through their careers to more senior positions, work gets offloaded. So, if you are a CEO, you have an executive assistant, at least one probably, who does a huge amount of work for you, maybe already did before AI quite a lot of email drafting for you. I know a lot of senior executives whose assistants, executive assistants, they draft their emails for them, and then the CEO may approve. Sometimes they don't even approve. It will go from the CEO. If it's a small issue, then the assistant will draft it and even send it. We haven't been worrying about CEOs saying, oh my goodness, they're not drafting their own emails and thinking about them. But it's because they're engaged in other types of work that are sufficiently cognitively demanding that their brain is continually tested and still develops. I do wonder, though, whether we're going to get to this point where, in a similar way as we have to go to the gym now, we might have to pursue certain activities either in our professional life or personal life to maintain the training status of our brain. If you think about, there's some really good data that highlights how work has become so much less physically demanding now. Even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, most jobs required more physical activity, even if they weren't manual roles, just simply by nature of the fact that we were all in the office and public transport and wasn't as efficient, and personal transport wasn't as efficient. Now, if we go back further and we imagine that someone, say 80 years ago, or even 100 years ago, watched my day, they'd see me go to the gym. But they wouldn't know it's a gym. They just watch this strange guy in his garage lifting heavy objects for no seeming purpose. Well, we do that because we've recognized that in our daily life and in our work, we don't get sufficient stimulus to maintain a healthy body. I wonder whether we're going to need cognitive gyms, because as we outsource increasing amounts of cognitive work personally and professionally to AI systems, we might need to voluntarily engage in cognitive work to maintain a healthy brain, in the same way as we have to voluntarily engage in physical work to maintain a healthy body. So I do think there's going to be a real effect. There's some early papers whose findings have been massively overstated in the media that suggest that our brains are already rotting, and I'm much more cautious than to believe those headlines right now. But that said, this is a conversation we need to be having now, and already starting to think about, just because we should doesn't mean we could, and what do we really need to do to continue to develop healthy, high-performing brains, perhaps even more importantly for the younger generation than it is for us, because we know those types of thinking are so critical for not just our thinking, but also even the neurological formation of our brains in terms of the structures. So that's my view. I think we've got to be aware of this, and I am concerned, I would say, about the potential.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating. I mean, and of course, it's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be utopia, or probably not dystopia. There will be, and it'll be unevenly distributed amongst those who engage with it, sort of proactively. What is this going to mean for me? Not just using it and seeing the result, feeling the results. Hopefully, to use your analogy, that how gyms have this enormous influx in January, and then by the end of the month, they're right back to the same, 20% use rate that they were at before. I don't know when in the year will be our cognitive high point, but it's hard on us when we ask ourselves to do something that we didn't have to do before and could kind of get away without doing.
Absolutely.
And maybe we'll have to program artificial intelligence in a way that it demands us to participate in the cognitive load. So before we let you go, something that we like to do on this podcast is to ask, what's making you happy?
Yeah. So for me, that's a pretty simple answer. It's got to be time with my family. I travel a lot with my work. A lot of what I do is speaking. I've got the privilege to speak at events all over the world. I did something like 97 flights last year. But that time with my family is really precious. And, as I mentioned, we've got 2 kids, 2 boys. And as they're getting older, just really enjoying the fascinating conversations we end up having around the dinner table. Spending quality time with my wife, who also works with me on the business. But when we get to spend time together, whether it's just a lunch, maybe in the work day, and where we get to have a good chat about personal and professional things, it's those simple moments are really what bring me the most enduring joy.
Oh, that's wonderful. And that certainly would seem to be an indicator of a healthy relationship that you successfully work together. That's quite lovely. And I don't know that every marriage, even every good marriage, could withstand
Yeah,
or
doesn't work for everyone, does it? But thankfully, it's worked for us.
that's great. All right, one last question. What do you have on the horizon that we should know about?
So you mentioned this idea of regeneration earlier. My new book, Regenerative Performance, is out now. That represents several years of research, real world application with organizations ranging from Formula One teams to Fortune 500 companies. And that core message that sustainable high performance comes from finding a new mental operating system, rhythms of effort and recovery, not endless grinding. Feels really urgent now, perhaps more than ever, as AI reshapes how we work. So that I'm continuing to launch that. It only recently came out, and so there's podcasts like this. There's other opportunities. That's something I'm really excited about, and then also continuing to speak at conferences and corporate events about these ideas. So if I was to look to the future, and if I was to kind of share one message that I'd like people to take away, it would be that the path to exceptional performance doesn't require burning yourself out, and the science is really clear that recovery and focus aren't luxuries. They're the foundation of sustainable excellence. And so looking to the future on the horizon, I'm looking forward to sharing that online, in social media, in my corporate speaking events, in my book, and just hopefully inspiring people with a vision that we just have to be willing to try and work differently, and that positive change is still possible.
Words to live by and to end on. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for spending some time with us today. Have a good one.
Thanks, Stefan.
Bye.